economic, but they have deeply political and social roots, some informed by our histories and experiences of slavery and colonialism. And when I think of discrimination, I think a lot about power and how discrimination is exerting power over another person for indicators or traits that sometimes they have no control over, such as sexual orientation, race, class, ability, and that this discrimination and the exercise of power in acting discrimination is used as a means to control and suppress the right to choice and livelihood for citizens and peoples around the world. And, I think a lot of the intersectional analysis that we see taking place and the intersectional markers we see, especially in civil society, around combating discrimination, use sort of a tick box approach to understand when discrimination is happening. But I'd like to put forward that one of the ways we can reflect on whether it's happening is to apply deep listening. And deep listening means being open to being confronted by the discomfort that others are experiencing as the result of our actions, and recognizing that whether or not we see our power, that it can be exercised in ways that detriment others based on their identity markers that sometimes they have no control over, and that it's a soft and a hard application of power. Sometimes it's overt, but sometimes it's softer. Our assumptions about who has capability, who has knowledge, who has the right to be in the space, who has the right to speak, who has the right to participate in society. For me, these are some of the critical discussions about discrimination that need to emerge. And we see that with mass mobilization and the rise of activism across the world over the past 2 years, that this heart of understanding power is critical to understanding how to undo discrimination. Thank you.
Thank you, Mesana. You give a really good introduction about the discrimination, and I really liked it when you said that we really have to be deep listening, and only by deep listening we can detect and understand when discrimination is really and actually happening. We could also discuss why the struggle of Mandela to end discrimination should be an example. And I think this question could be directly answered by Brian. When he could actually present his experience in South Africa and how he worked on the cases of apartheid and how the struggle of Nelson Mandela really brought about a change.
Thank you very much, Samaya, and thank you very much for organising this. I should say really at the start that, I'm no authority on Mandela, and there is someone else on the panel here who is South African, right? Far be it from me then to be the Mandela guy, right? But I would say very briefly that I absolutely agree with what Mesana says. I think that discrimination is on one level and a real level really uncomplicated, right? It's the unfair treatment of somebody or a group of people because of who they are. I mean, it's no more complicated than that. The other question you asked, though, how do you spot it? I think is deceptively simple because, and I also think, back to what Mesana says about power, I would say, there's probably a correlation there between the more power you have, the less likely you are to see it or to want to see it, right? So if you talk about a man with white privilege, he really shouldn't be the one determining like who's discriminated against and who's not. Sometimes it's super obvious, right? In apartheid South Africa, it was codified, right? There were certain laws, the Group Areas Act. If you were categorized as white, you lived there. If you were categorized as Indian, you lived there. If you were categorized as colored, you lived there. If you were categorized as black, you lived there. I mean, these absurd 4 racial categories, right? And that was fairly obvious and in a sense more straightforward and easier to deal with. If you were of a particular race, you were allowed to do particular things. It's also very powerful when it's when it's used more subtly, I guess. And so, you know, often I think people, the best people certainly to spot discrimination are going to be the people who are discriminated against rather than the discriminators. I mean, sometimes the discrimination is absolutely deliberate and blatant, and the discriminators, if I've invented a terrible word, know they're doing it. Other times, I think they don't realize they're doing it. I'm not sure that that's, you know, a lot less worse. It's still pretty bad. So I'd say that in terms of Mandela and it's very interesting, I think, the legacy of Mandela. I mean, you know, I mean, not for any jokes here, but I'm you know, old enough to remember when he was in prison. And many people I come across now who cite him as an inspiration aren't, right? I mean, they're just of a different generation. And there's been a sort of a mythology, a bit of sanitization around him. It's also true of others. Martin Luther King certainly has become super sanitized, right? And people pick the comfortable bits out of his career about what they are okay with quoting, and not the bits which might be challenging for them. And similarly with Mandela, I mean, you know, I think we all have, as much as, you know, everybody in the world thinks the one thing, which they don't, but there's a sort of consensual view about Mandela. Good guy, very patient, very understanding, stoic, all those years in prison, a little hazier about his, and a little bit uncomfortable about his view on using armed force or violence to achieve ends. Some discomfort about some of the allies, which he kept for many years and sometimes always. For instance, Robert Mugabe, Gaddafi. Mandela's government sold loads of arms to the Assad regime in Syria. I mean, I think we do Mandela and his memory a disservice if we just have this totally sanitized, rosy view of his life without mistakes. It's not fair on him, and it's not fair on others who are trying to emulate him. Because what I hear sometimes from human rights defenders is this sort of self-defeat in, we haven't got Mandela, or we haven't got somebody who is perfect. And in a sense, really, even Mandela wasn't Mandela. I mean, the reality of the guy wasn't what this hagiography, what this reputation has been. That's not to take away for a second the massive achievements that he was responsible for and his leadership. I realize I'm talking for too long, and Justin wants to talk. I'd like to come back at some stage to this idea of Mandela having like superpowers, basically, you know, a once in a lifetime leader, and whether or not that's a useful way to see him, and whether or not it's a fair way to see him. But anyway, I'll say more than enough there.
Thank you, Brian. It was very important what you highlighted about Mandela and his struggle for change, and also his personality on the other side. Thank you so much. Nidal, I see that you want to add something.
It's very nice. Brian spoke about the direct discrimination, which was in South Africa, like areas for the white, areas for the Indians, and this is the separation or segregation. But when we see there are indirect discrimination, which is happening as well in certain areas, we, for example, if I will speak about Bahrain, we face discrimination, even if it's not direct, either because of your gender, either because of your belief, either because of your religion, and we are in denial. Even in Bahrain, we as well, either against the citizen, or the citizens sometimes are against the non-nationals or against the migrant worker. We are also part of it. And this is something, when we deny that we have a problem, we cannot fix it. The first step is accepting that we have a problem, and this way we can fix our problem. Without it, and this can only happen with education, and this is the lesson which we learned from Mandela when we go again to Mandela, because Mandela thought all the lessons which was taught from Mandela, his courage, his patience, non-violence. I mean, he spent 27 years in jail, but he still continued calling for the same rights. But he also encouraged the education because he thought that the education can be the tool for changing everything. And with educating the people, you can make them accepting the others. You can teach them that acceptance is the first tool, because we might be different, but we learn from our differences. We can take these differences as a tool to accept the others and to learn from the others, rather than thinking this difference is creating a division. Let's use the differences. We are different. We are even the people, we are different, but accept the others. This is the main thing. And this can only happen with education.
I totally agree with you, Nidal. That's, in fact, it makes it even more complicated when you, in fact, when we practice discrimination and we don't know and we don't realize that we are doing it unconsciously. Education is very important for people who unconsciously practice discrimination, and also for people who are being discriminated against. Because if you don't know your rights, you will accept whatever comes toward your direction. So you have to know and be educated about your rights. And this way you can, when you're discriminated against, you can say, no, stop, I'm not going to accept that anymore. And as you said also, Nidal, I come myself from Bahrain, and I've been working in human rights organizations for the past few years, and I've witnessed myself discrimination, as Nidal mentioned, based on religion, based on name and family name, and even family name. Yeah, you will be discriminated against because you hold this family name. You're deprived from privileges, from high-ranking positions at work, even your studies and scholarships. Like, you can study all the years in school and you deserve a scholarship, but you will be deprived from a scholarship opportunity just because you come from this family that is not being well seen by the state itself. Thank you, Nidal. Thank you so much. Justin.
Yes, well, thanks a lot for the invitation to be part of this, and very important topic and a great panel. And I think also I would just like to say, I totally agree with what has already been said there by all of you. In terms of the definition and discrimination, in terms of access to power and privilege, and in many of the struggles we see today are about discrimination or against discrimination. We see the Black Lives Matter movement or the Me Too movement, or we see different groups that are trying to address inherent differences in power and privilege. But we also see the counter reaction to those forces, those who are fearing that they're losing their privileges and feeling that their position is threatened. And sort of in that sense, we are that's sort of where a lot of the struggles we see today are, and especially what we've been seeing in the US for the last couple of years. That is what you really see. And then we do that. Then we also see this at a time when, in the midst of the pandemic, and I think it was the campaign organization I was said the other day, they had a picture on Instagram saying, so it's not right that we say that we are in the same boat in this pandemic, and we are not. We are in the same storm, but some are on a cruise ship or super yacht, and some are not. And in a way, you can see also that how the pandemic is, reinforcing or making some of the discrimination we see even more evident. Even if you're a migrant worker in Bahrain or Qatar or Saudi Arabia, or if you're a Dalit in India, or when you look at in Norway, in Oslo, in Norway, and you can see that there are there are parts of the city where you will have more, people who are poorer, who live in dwellings that are with more people, who needs to work in low paid jobs. They are more prone to be get COVID. So I think we also live at this time when these things are being reinforced, being strengthened. And when it comes to, I think, the example of Mandela, I think obviously there are, and I also lived in South Africa for many years, and obviously there are many challenges in South Africa still. There are a lot of the, as Masana and Brian very well know, there is, there are many unresolved disputes and challenges and structural issues, and it's one of the most unequal countries in the world still. But I think one of the lessons for Mandela, I think, for today would be his change management, that he was able to both be able to mobilize those who were fighting for power, but also was able to communicate with those who feared losing their privilege, and in a way soften their resistance against it. And I think some kind of that kind of dialogue, if you're looking at for example the US today, you will, how do you manage that dialogue? How do you find some kind of common ground, some common language in that struggle? I think that's something we can take from Mandela.
Thank you, Justin. I really liked when you said that facing this pandemic, we're not on the same boat, but we're facing the same storm. In fact, it makes sense, and I never thought about it this way. Yeah, that's true. That's true. So discrimination, we talked about how we are detecting it. Brian gave us examples of how it was in South Africa. I see, Brian, you want, there's something that you would like to add and share with us?
Yeah, I promise I'll be brief. But I think that to tackle discrimination successfully, we need to do what Mandela managed to convince many people of, which is that the equation is not like a zero-sum game, right? It's not like there are all these people with power and they discriminate against all these other people. And the solution to that is to let the victims of discrimination have all the power, because then it just tilts up the other way, right? The case you have to persuade people of is discrimination hurts not just the victim of discrimination, but the person who's doing the discriminating too. Now, Mandela wasn't the only person to be saying this, and wasn't the only person in apartheid South Africa to be saying this. Desmond Tutu used to say it very eloquently too. But the basic premise in that context, in that sort of discrimination, is that racism hurts the racist as well as the victim of racism. And I think the COVID analogy is a perfect one for this. You can have people in the rich world hoarding the vaccines, right? So here we are, we're going to keep this stuff because, we can't afford to give it away and let poorer people in the world have it. That's the wrong equation. I don't just mean morally. I mean, if the rich world hoards the vaccines and lets the rest of the world get COVID, the rest of the world is going to get COVID, it's going to mutate, and it's going to come back to bite the rich people on the arse. And so it's in your self-interest to eradicate this discrimination, whether it's racism, whether it's hoarding the COVID. That's a very difficult thing to get people to let go of their perceived privilege, right? But I think a magical thing, and much as I'm against the mythology of Mandela, but really I think a magical thing he managed to do was to persuade enough people in South Africa at the time who had power that actually they're better off sharing it, that they win in a power sharing equation, rather than hoarding it all for themselves and being totally fearful all the time.
That's right, Brian. You mentioned that the discrimination can be harmful for both who practice discrimination and those who are being discriminated against. I would like to hear from Masana. How could discrimination be possibly harmful for a society? What are the harms of discrimination in a society?
You know, I'm listening very intently to the conversation. You know, I've done a lot of work on racial justice, feminist justice, not just gender justice, mass mobilization, creating safe spaces for people to show up. I will be honest, and I think for many young South Africans, especially Black South Africans, that the narrative of Mandela is contested. And part of the dangers of discrimination is really what underpins that discrimination, which I think a number of colleagues on the call have alluded to, is that oftentimes when discrimination is implemented, it's implemented with an economic impetus. And just very quickly, I'll just share a quick story. You know, I studied economics. And for many years since switching to activism, I was saying I'm a recovering economist because of the ways in which economists assume that their assumptions of the world, which by and large are based on, you know, what we call Homo economicus, the white, straight, cisgender, heterosexual man who acts in self-interest. You know, he makes his decisions based on utility and maximizing his utility. Even his goodwill to others is informed by the benefit that he will accrue through his actions. And it's a really powerful concept because it's underpinned even the mythology, not of Mandela, but of apartheid, and the impetus behind a lot of the discrimination that we see happening across the world is there's always an economic impetus. There's a hoarding of capital. There's, you know, in sort of Christian mythology, I won't identify my religion, you know, this hierarchy with man at the top with domination over everything in the world, right? And I'm speaking philosophically because if we want to understand the workings of discrimination and the violence it wreaks havoc on, is that our goal as people in this earth is to accumulate and innovate and expand our power and dominate and colonize. And sometimes we shift the language around that. Sometimes we speak about international development and aid. Sometimes we speak about ending conflict. Sometimes we speak about not interfering in national politics. And I think the case of Bahrain is quite interesting in that way because of the economic interests that then fuel discrimination itself as a former colony, right? And so discrimination is violent for the dehumanization and the creation of hierarchies in society that undermine everything else but self-interest. And this dehumanization, I think, much like Brian said, is a dehumanization that the sense of grandiosity that's created in those who are perpetuators of discrimination then cannot even recognize. They become alien to themselves. But what I want to caution us against is, you know, as we're talking and reflecting on discrimination in South Africa is the perfect example of this because apartheid is still very much alive. The inequalities in our country very much exist. But if Black people in South Africa were a country, Black people, they would have the highest levels of inequality in the entire world. And this is because discrimination pushes those who are underneath in this hierarchy to then reinforce that very discrimination in order to survive. Ultimately, the economic impetus behind our existence, our need for food, our need for livelihood, our need to send our kids to school in a neoliberal system cannot take place without the extraction and exploitation of others. And how do we undo this? And I think this is the beauty of the mass mobilizations that we've seen, which are largely faceless, right? And very occasionally you'll have someone step up and say, I'm the leader of this protest movement, and we don't see them last very long. This horizontal, massive push to challenge the ways in which economic power dehumanizes different parts of the society, for me, has been the most inspiring part of undoing discrimination.
It's very, very passionate what you said, Masana. Thank you. Thank you. You made me feel like how it is to feel as a person who would be discriminated against, and also that who practice the discrimination, how they would be feeling, holding all the power for themselves and denying others from it. Yeah. We understand the problem, and we understand that there is something that needs to be done. As human rights defenders, how can we work together to raise the voice of human rights and equality for everyone? And how can we build a society and a community that enjoys the highest possible levels of cohesion and equality? I would like to hear on that from Justin.
Well, I just wanted to also first just to say that I very much agree with what Masana is saying, and also that one of the things that we see in when we talk about discrimination is that if you are in a privileged position, it's very difficult to see discrimination, and it's easy to see it in retrospect. So you can talk about apartheid South Africa, or you can talk about the US during Martin Luther King, but being you constantly see that and being a male white middle-aged man, it's I think one of the first things you need to know is that you don't have a clue. You have to understand your limitations in order to in your ability to see discrimination. And I think
hang on. Like, I agree a little bit as another white middle-aged man here, but that's a little bit of an excuse, right? Like, we don't see it. Of course we see it. We don't see all of it, but we see plenty of it. And most of the time, or much of the time, we just decide not to do anything about it. We're not blind to discrimination.
Yeah, well, I think some of it, but I think also that, if you look at how many in a privileged position reacts, and they you will have a lot of people saying, I'm not sexist, I'm not racist, but and then you have and there are a lot of people that you see get very defensive when you discuss these issues, and then you come talking about woke culture, and you're very anxious about all this. And I think what Masana you said in the beginning was that we need some deep listening. It's I think a lot of people, you need to create that atmosphere where you can actually listen to each other, trying to understand, not trying to. And I think that's in a way how do you make how do you create that conversation where people are not getting on the defensive, where you can and I think that's one of the challenges we have as a human rights movement, because we do see that sort of resentment. We see many places. We see it in the US. We see it in Europe, where you see because of new groups getting more rights, or getting trying to share this cake, as you say, Brian. You see also you see people are voting for anti-democratic forces, for authoritarian governments. They are you have a sort of a counterattack on the rule of law many places. You look in Poland or Hungary, and how are we able to how would you be able to talk to these people that are feeling that it's a zero-sum game? How do we as a human rights movement, how can we contribute to that? And how do we in a way make sure that we are also, I think, in some cases not seen as in sort of an elitist group that are talking down to people, but we are actually also we are able to see how people that are feeling they are losing out on influence, losing out, how are we able to create a conversation with them, so that you don't get these counter forces that we see at play, especially in, I think, many places in Europe and the US these days.
Nidal. It's mute, Nidal. Can you open the microphone, please?
As a human rights group, you know that many countries are signatories of the International Convention of Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination, including Bahrain, which is one of them. I think we should encourage organizations to submit shadow reports, to submit complaints of highlighting discrimination issues which is happening. Not lots of organizations do focus on preparing shadow reports about discrimination, and we should encourage to do something like that. I mean, to submit and be part of it, because the discrimination can really lead to division and hate and dehumanization. And it can create bigger issue, really bigger issues. So the only solution is in the beginning I said education, because the biggest drive towards discrimination is our tendency to categorize the people with the, while if we adopted their differences and we celebrated in another way, we celebrate the differences rather than regard it as a threat or tension. This is the way we will find a solution. Living together, listening to each other, dialogue together, having a platform to talk to each other, accepting each other. This is the only solution. I think we as a human rights organization should be the leading in that. Should have the, unfortunately, as you know, in Bahrain, we are facing very much difficulty to have such thing, but maybe international organization can be a leader in that way, because mixing together is a good solution to end discrimination. As well as human rights organization, we should be leading in that matter. Thank you.
Oh, Nidal, you know, I admire your loving nature of accepting differences and just celebrate those differences. In fact, it makes sense. It makes so much sense, in fact. Like the beauty lies in the differences and not in the similarities. In fact, similarity is boring. Brian, I heard you saying that people who practice discrimination, they know that they are doing it.
I think often we do. I mean, you know, I know I have practiced discrimination, and Masana wants to speak, so I'm just going to speak for a sentence. I would say, Nadal, that would be great if the human rights movement or NGOs would lead in this, but, you know, the human rights movement and human rights NGOs are not immune from their own discrimination either, right? Let's not come off as we've sorted it all out here, because I've worked for several major NGOs, and I've never seen where there wasn't discrimination inside them.
I mean, I'd love to work with Nadal, and she knows I'm one of her biggest fans, just because I know you lead with such consciousness, and I think that it is the embodying of this humanity that recognizes people for more than their identity markers that is critical. I want to reflect on a study that I was a part of. It's a UNDP study on social contracting, where we looked at sort of in South Africa and in several countries, including in the Middle East and the Gulf region specifically, we looked at what drives a resilient social contract. And discrimination is obviously an impediment to a resilient social contract. And one of the case studies from South Africa, I was the lead country researcher, that emerged was that, and I'm sorry to hop on about economics, but it's really important to me. You know, we had at the end of apartheid this approach where we said, you know, united in our diversity. It's literally our slogan. We are the Rainbow Nation. We accept one another. We're going to practice reconciliation. And I mean, I'm holding my heart because it's still quite painful when you reflect on, just the extent of ravaging that has taken place since the end of apartheid. And what the study found is you cannot have this reconciliation, this acceptance built on high levels of inequality. It is absolutely impossible to foster an acceptance and a unity without addressing the access to just livelihoods. If it's a matter of survival and a matter of hunger for you versus someone else who's living in luxury, what is the point of connection? In South Africa, the point of connection across races, across genders has been, I am your domestic worker. I come and meet you in your space, and then I'm removed in my identity from my space to exist. You hear how I'm talking as a Black South African. It's either you're encountering this violent existence, or you're forced to assimilate and speak a language that basically, makes you this homogenous creature. So you're accepted on the terms of those who are in power. Now, people would argue, yes, the ANC is in power. We have a new democratic dispensation. Completely true. But when we look at economic power and how that has been replicated even by our Black government and the ways of dehumanization, I keep coming back to this point. It is absolutely critical that we address the inequalities that exist. The rise of the right wing across the world has also been because the enemy is posited as those who are different. In the case of Central America and Latin America, those who cross the border into the US are different. Migrants are different. Religious minorities are different. So you have to have this common enemy in order to justify the exploitation that you experience within the economic system. But what does addressing discrimination look like if we shift our focus to where wealth is concentrated? And I just want to end very quickly on this. I read this very funny post. It was a tweet by someone, and that if a monkey hoarded all of the bananas whilst all of the other monkeys died, we'd launch studies into what's wrong with this monkey. Why is it such a hoarder? Why is it letting its people die? But if humans do it, then we put them on the cover of Forbes magazine, right? And so for me, I think the racism, the violence, the gender discrimination, religious discrimination is oftentimes a distraction from those who are in power, who benefit from this collective dehumanization and use people as their foot soldiers for violence.
It's so powerful, Masana, what you said, and I was very touched. Thank you for sharing that valuable input with us. So we go back to the question that we had: how can we build a community that enjoys a high level of equality? And I would like to hear from Brian.
I'm happy to talk, but Justin had his hand up there, I think, for a sec.
But you go, Brian, and I'll jump in afterwards.
Okay, so I don't think it's easy. If it was easy, we would have figured it out a long time ago. I do think that there are different ways to have that conversation, and I absolutely agree with Masana that the economic underpinning of this is really where much of the rest of it flows from. Let me talk just for a second about Bahrain, where it's not identical, or even I would say very similar to apartheid South Africa. One similarity is that you have a minority group in charge at the expense, if we can call it that, of a majority group, which is sort of unusual. It's not unique, but it's sort of unusual. Usually it's a majority faction, whether it's based on race or sect or whatever, oppressing a minority. So Bahrain is interesting that way, in that, one similarity with South Africa is that a minority of people manage to exert power by and large over a majority. But it's multi-layered, right? So I'm glad that Masana brought up the question there of domestic workers, because there are plenty of domestic workers in Bahrain, many of whom are discriminated against by both sects. Right, this isn't just like a goodies and baddies, right? And I think this is also part of a misuse of the legacy of overcoming apartheid, I mean, I'm not going to say black and white because that just confuses it. But basically, you know, that there was really just two sides to this, and the things that one side did were all great, and the things the other side did were all wrong. And since then, it gets very complicated, right? If you buy into that, because then how come everything isn't great since, right? And it's not. In terms of overcoming it, I do think that there is much still and will be for generations to come to study beneficially in the example of Mandela, trying to argue that, you know, we really will all benefit from an end or reduction, at least, in discrimination. And without wanting to oversimplify or dumb this down too much, but when I argue with people about this, at its simplest, you know, I say, look, you want your country, whatever country, and you want your country's football team to win the World Cup, right? And if you say we're only going to have white players, or we're not going to have Jewish players, or I think the day is coming soon where we're only going to have male players, then actually you all lose out, right? Because if you want your team to win the World Cup, you need to have the strongest possible team there. And that may include people who have been discriminated against, who you haven't let play before. But if you do that and you have your strongest team and you win the World Cup, like, the whole country benefits, right? So I understand it's generally more complicated than that, but I think the principle there is the same, that the inclusion and recognition of people on merit is really begins to chip away at the idea that, well, discrimination is sort of inevitable, and that's just a short step away of then saying, actually, there are some benefits to discrimination. It's all a bit chaotic if we just like let everybody in, right? It'd be chaos. So, but I think that showing a collective benefit is really the first step to trying to figure it out.
Thank you so much, Brian. Justin.
Well, there are so many points to pick up on here, and I think just on what Masana was talking about, you know, on sort of the economic exploitation, economic model, I think it is very important to have that in mind. I think that's one of those structures that you often don't see, you know, underpinning discrimination, and I think the story about the monkey, you know, there are a lot of people that would. You know, a lot of research shows that what we perceive as fair is quite universal. You know, there are some differences between different countries, and you know how much difference we tolerate, but more or less, you know, people would understand, you know, what is a fair distribution. But I think, you know, discrimination, both, you know, it's about putting people into categories and giving different qualities to those categories, and that kind of legitimizes those differences, and then the economic differences also reinforces those categories, and so I think it is very important to look at that sort of linkage between, you know, economic inequality, economic systems, and discrimination. And then also just wanted on another point is that, you know, as human rights defenders, as people working in human rights organizations, we do need to uphold the principle that, you know, it is legitimate and right to interfere in other countries' business. Because, you know, you see that, you know, there are certain universal values, you know, and then if we talk about the principles of anti-discrimination, you know, and upholding that, you know, it is actually right to care. You know, we can actually, you know, because we see so many times that if you try to address issues like this, if we support each other, you know, governments are putting limits on how we can work together, how we can support each other. And also, you know, with all these foreign agent laws and different things we're seeing these days, and as you experience in Bahrain and as we experience other places, it's that you know, there are, you know, governments saying that certain kind of, in a way, discrimination is, you know, is intrinsic to our culture here. We don't want any interference. You know, it's delegitimizing, labeling people as foreign agents if you are standing up for LGBT rights or women's rights or whatever. So I think that, you know, maintaining the universality of certain principles and being able to support each other and believing in the principle of solidarity is something that is we need to fight for.
Thank you, Justin. I see Nidal wants to add something. The microphone, Nidal.
Typical me. Again, yeah. Let me tell you, thought I wanted to say something about Bahrain itself, because we are, as we know, we have a discrimination, either education, either religious, either disability, let's say wages, at workplaces, gender. We are really facing discrimination. And to find a solution, we have to go back to the Mandela. Mandela was always calling for a dialogue. And without dialogue, we cannot fix it. We need to have a proper dialogue to fix all these discrimination issues in Bahrain. You spoke about the environment of cohesion. We should have this environment between NGO and anti-discrimination bodies. Maybe we should create an index, annual discrimination index to be followed. And this can be the start. I mean, even if it can be on a smaller, let's mean a region or certain area, and it can be an index. And it's by starting a joint projects and initiative to publish that index, it might be a good solution. Like if we have an index for discrimination, this will be something which is followed.
Thank you, Nidal. Really nice ideas and initiatives. Maybe we can really consider that. To wrap up, because we have a few minutes left, we agree. Nidal, yes?
Masana wanted to say something.
Masana, go ahead.
I'm happy to thank you, Nidal. I just wanted to build on that, and I think it's I'll be very quick. It's an emerging theme on the need for dialogue, and I wonder if Asma, we can include it in our concluding remarks. You know, I think Nidal's position is unique, coming from a civic space closed country where the options for dialogue are so limited. I mean, even in apartheid South Africa, mobilization and resistance were clamped down on, but I think, you know, there was still independent media. There were still options for people to escape the country, and it was incredibly difficult. And we see a lot of this in the Gulf regions, just the complexity of technology and the violence with which states have closed down the space for dialogue. And I want to, I don't know if it's a close link, I want to link this to what's emerging from Justin and Brian around, you know, those who have privilege. And I think everyone has a privilege, but those who conventionally have privilege and the need for dialogue in those spaces. And just, it's more of a question really back to the group, and I hope it can be included in the reflections, which is, first of all, how do you have dialogue with those who have power and who enact discrimination and are unwilling to change? And then second of all, how do you ensure that, you know, as a racial justice activist, you know, one of the things we say is that, you know, Black people, we're not going to do the work for you. If you want to learn about racism, go read a blog, you know? And I think similarly so, you know, how do we foster that those who have power are then willing to talk amongst themselves around what needs to change? I won't say much about Mandela because I know it's contentious for South Africans, Nidal, but I do respect the power of his image in in providing an alternative to what we normally see in transitions. And I hope that that would be reflected on collectively.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Masana. We agree that discrimination is ugly and it should not exist anywhere, and no one should be really subjected to discrimination. I think the act of discrimination is a result of prejudgment. When we judge others based on our own ideas of what is right, what is wrong, what should be, what shouldn't be, then we start to discriminate against others. But if we only know what are the stories of those people, like me being a migrant in France, if I only put myself, or others put themselves in the place of migrants and what realities they escaped from, knowing their stories, for example, we will not judge them, and we will not be discriminatory to others, because being discriminated against it feels horrible. It feels that you're excluded. It feels like you cannot be yourself because you already know that you're being judged without being heard. I think there is a lot to be done on discrimination in all aspects and in all fields, and I hope that the civil society and the human rights organism and the world will continue to work all together to do something about this, because it's ugly, it's horrible, and it shouldn't exist. I was really happy today having this discussion with all of you. It was really valuable input from each and every one of you. Thank you so much, Brian, Julie from Human Rights First. Thank you, Masana from Civicus, Nidal from Bahrain Center for Human Rights, and Justin from Rafto Foundation for Human Rights. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much for organising. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Many thanks. Thanks for organising.
Thank you. Cheers. Thank you so much, everyone.